Well, good evening. Welcome to the Honors College. My name is Dustin Gish. I'm Professor of Honors in the college and the Executive Director of the Phronēsis minor and program in Politics and Ethics. On behalf of the college and Phronēsis, let me thank you all for being here. This lecture today is the second in the series inaugurating the Lyceum Initiative. The Lyceum Initiative is dedicated to a renewal of civic education as part of the academic mission of the college and of the university as inscribed in our founding charter. Our purpose is patriotic and civic, not partisan, to prepare students for thoughtful citizenship in a constitutional republic by fostering the virtues of mind and of heart that sustain a free people. Now, in pursuing this purpose through the Lyceum Initiative, the Honors College joins a national movement in higher education dedicated to reclaiming civic learning and civic virtue as essential elements of our liberal education and of American citizenship. Civic knowledge and an understanding of the fundamental principles of our constitutional order establish the only true foundation for reasonable civic discourse, civic engagement, and leadership. The Lyceum Fellows, many of whom are here, represent our first cohort of honor students whose academic work, research projects, and enthusiasm for the study of American constitutionalism and our founding documents embrace the mission of the Lyceum Initiative and are helping us to pursue its mission during our inaugural year. This lecture series is also part of that mission. In the first lecture in this series delivered last month for Constitution Day and Citizenship Day, Dr. Paul Cariste gave an inspiring talk about the essential need, especially in our times, to cultivate knowledge and virtue among citizens through civic education. If you're not able to attend the lecture, we made it available on the YouTube channel for the Honors College, and I encourage you to listen to it. On Constitution Day, we're called to study and reflect upon that founding document of our federal republic, especially the principles that are embedded in the preamble, which implicitly acknowledge the need for continued reverence by and informed participation of the people themselves in order for the union to become more perfect over time. But we cannot limit our reflection to a single day. The pursuit of justice and the protection of the blessings of equality and liberty for ourselves and our posterity require citizens in each generation to be vigilant in reflecting upon the principles of our national union and cultivating civic virtue. Lincoln foresaw the need for this obligation and duty of citizens in his Lyceum address. In 1838, this address by Lincoln gravely warned his fellow citizens of the dire threat posed to the nation by the political violence which accompanied the gradual erosion of respect for the rule of law and reverence for our constitutional order. The perpetuation of our political institutions, he argued, depended on enlightened citizenship and reflective patriotism. Each generation must renew its devotion to constitutional self-government if the republic is indeed to endure. Now, this task of preserving our republic has become ever more urgent. America today confronts a kind of constitutional crisis caused in part by a grave deficit in civic knowledge and civic literacy among our fellow citizens. This deficit undermines the ability of citizens to engage in civil discourse and reasoned debate. This deficit fuels ideological partisanship and encourages unreflective advocacy of extreme positions. It also contributes to the rise of unthinkable political violence. Despite existing state mandates, many, if not most, Americans are not properly educated in the basic civic knowledge that every citizen in our constitutional republic should possess. As Socrates himself argued long ago, knowledge is virtue and the foundation for all just action. Now, to meet the challenge of our times as a public institution of American higher education, we've inaugurated the Lyceum Initiative. In fulfilling our strategic mission, our vision here in the Honors College, we are committed to the formation of our students, as our mission says, as lifelong agile learners through liberal education, and also as engaged citizens through civic education. The Lyceum Initiative thus takes up the task of cultivating the knowledge of fundamental principles in our republic and the virtues of good citizenship to preserve and perpetuate our constitutional order. Next year marks the semi-quincentennial of our founding as a nation, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence signed in the summer of 1776. In the spring semester, we'll have 5 national scholars speaking in this series, and their focus will be entirely upon the principles of the Declaration. But our attention today is the principles of constitutionalism, not those of our state republics or the federal Constitution of the United States, but the one example from the past that our founders looked to as a possible model, the Constitution of the ancient Roman Republic. Constitutional forms depend upon an informed citizen body to endure, and they must be renewed from time to time by a return to first principles. Without a living memory of and devotion to those principles as a guide in the present, a constitutional order risks faltering and perhaps collapsing. This was a crisis the Roman statesman, orator, and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero confronted in his own times. To help us better understand this ancient constitutional crisis, one in many ways not unlike our own, and in particular Cicero's response to the crisis, we're fortunate to have with us today a scholar and a teacher who has spent most of his career thinking about Cicero and his contribution to our understanding of the liberal arts and civic education. Dr. Robert Proctor is Professor Emeritus of Italian Language and Literature at Connecticut College, where he taught courses for over 4 decades, inspiring students with his love of Italian and of Italy. His passion for Dante's Divine Comedy and the Italian Renaissance led him to introduce students to the beauty and wonders of Italy, the enduring beauty of Renaissance art and literature, as the founding director of a Center for International Studies and the Liberal Arts. In this role, he brought a group of Connecticut College students with him to Rome, Italy, during the fall of 2000 to study at John Cabot University, which is fortunately where we first met and became friends. One of Professor Proctor's scholarly interests is the history of education, especially the history of the Studia Humanitatis and the Artes Liberales. His award-winning book on education's great amnesia was reissued in paperback with a new title, Defining the Humanities: How Rediscovering a Tradition Can Improve Our Schools. He's published and lectured extensively on Dante, Italian literature, contemporary Italian politics and economy, the humanities, and of course, the liberal arts tradition. He's a former fellow of Villa Itati, Harvard University's Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, located in Florence, and a former fellow of the National Humanities Institute at Yale University. Yesterday, he spoke to a group of our honor students about a famous excerpt from Cicero's treatise De Republica, on the Republic, an excerpt known as the Dream of Scipio. Professor Proctor's eloquent account of the intelligible cosmic order described by Cicero in Scipio's dream reminds us of the inspiration we must take from our inherited past and our obligation to work in the present to preserve and defend that inheritance for posterity. His lecture today is based on his current book manuscript on the collapse of the Roman world into political violence and civil war, and the effort of Cicero as a philosopher to save his republic. The title of his lecture is From Violence to Beauty: Cicero's Response to the Constitutional Crisis of the Roman Republic. Please welcome Dr. Robert Proctor.
Thank you, Dr. Gish, for the fine introduction. Before I begin my talk, I'm inspired to think about what Cicero would say to you. If you look around the room, most of you are between the ages, it looks to me, between 18 to 21? Okay. Cicero explicitly states on many occasions that young Romans must read his writings. He wants people your age to understand carefully what he thinks about the situation of the Roman Republic, because he looks at people your age as the age group that is going to save the Republic. So when you hear me read Cicero's words, keep in mind that he's writing for you. You should be taking this personally. Cicero didn't know anything about Texas. He didn't know anything about the University of Houston, but he was very aware that it was young Romans who were moving into positions of leadership who were the ones who would save the Roman Republic. So Cicero here would say, this is really for you, not for people my age. So keep that in mind. Cicero's response to the political violence that destroyed the Roman Republic was the liberal arts ideal of education and the two kinds of self-transcendence that this ideal inculcates. A Roman self-transcendence in which you join the company of the ancestors who founded and preserved the Republic, and a Greek self-transcendence in which your mind becomes one with the beautiful order and harmony of the universe. This is the key idea I'd like you to take away today. Two forms of self-transcendence. Violence is physical, but it begins in thought. From Cicero's point of view, the civil wars that destroyed the Republic resulted from errors in thinking. The right education could correct them. Cicero really believed in the importance of education. So let's look first at the ideal of education that Cicero proposes for the orator and the philosopher-statesman, and see how this ideal can lead to self-transcendence, a self-transcendence that enables a political leader to rise above personal ambition and the violence that often accompanies ambition. Our phrase, liberal arts, is a direct transliteration of the Latin phrase artes liberales. And the first recorded use of this phrase appears in the writings of Cicero, who lived from 106 BC to 43 BC. In his dialogue on the orator, and I'll be quoting the Latin title, De Oratore, Cicero stages a fictional debate concerning the nature of eloquence. And here's the question: is the ideal orator just a good debater or a broad and deep thinker? Think about that. If you want to be a good politician, is it enough to be a good speaker, to have a facility with words, or should you also be a deep thinker? And this is really the debate that goes on in the De Oratore. The De Oratore presents the case for the latter. Eloquence is not just natural talent perfected by practice and training in rhetorical techniques. Eloquence flows from broad learning and philosophical speculation. In the words of one of the protagonists of this dialogue, Crassus, quote, "No one will be able to be an orator crowned with all praise unless he has arrived at a knowledge of all the important subjects and arts," close quote. Later, Crassus says, quote, "The true orator must have investigated, heard, read, discussed, handled, and debated everything that belongs to the life of human beings, insofar as these constitute the field and subject matter of the orator's activity." Human life includes the divine. Crassus can thus summarize the essence of broad learning by equating it with what one of his interlocutors in the dialogue says is actually the subject matter of philosophy. The orator must be able to speak about the nature of the sky and the earth, the divine and the human. Now, this is really interesting. In speaking about the nature of the earth and the nature of the divine, important things, actually makes you more eloquent. Crassus, as Crassus puts it, quote, "An abundance of things begets an abundance of words. And if there is honor in the things themselves about which one speaks, there comes forth a certain natural splendor in the words." That means that all of you who are in the Honors College are potentially eloquent because you're studying the highest things, the more important things. You see the relationship between subject matter and eloquence. That's what Cicero's talking about. Now, this is interesting. In describing the ideal orator, Cicero is actually describing himself. Plutarch begins his life of Cicero by observing that from the earliest age, Cicero showed a quick mind and a fondness for study and broad learning. Quote, when he was in the age for taking lessons, his natural talent shone out clearly, and he won the name and fame among boys, so that their fathers used to visit the school in order to see Cicero with their own eyes and observe the quickness and intelligence in his studies for which he was extolled. And Plutarch goes on to observe Cicero's love of broad learning, saying that Cicero, quote, showed himself, as Plato thought a nature should, that was fond of learning and fond of wisdom, capable of welcoming all knowledge and incapable of slighting any kind of literature or training. Later, Plutarch says, Cicero often asked his friends not to call him an orator, but a philosopher, because he had chosen philosophy as an occupation, but used oratory merely as an instrument for attaining the needful ends of a political career. This goes against what a lot of people say about Cicero, that he was a statesman who dabbled in philosophy. Cicero wanted to be known as a philosopher. Cicero was born in 106 BC in a small town south of Rome. Cicero's father wanted his sons to have a political life which he himself could not have because of poor health. So he sent Cicero and his brother and cousin off to Rome. And when Cicero was around 10 years old, he and his younger brother went to live in the city that was now the center of a growing empire. Here's a key idea I'd like you to take away. Bloody political violence stands out as a gruesome backdrop to Cicero's otherwise happy descriptions of his boyhood studies in Rome. Consider his recollection of the philosopher Philo of Larissa. Philo was the head of Plato's academy in Athens. Philo came to Rome in 88 BC when Cicero was 18 years old. So what I'm quoting now is something Cicero observed when he was your age. Here in Cicero's word is the effect Philo had on him. Note carefully the historical context Cicero provides in speaking about Philo. These are Cicero's words. When Publius Sulpicius was tribune and spoke daily in the people's assembly, I got to know his style of speaking thoroughly. At the same time, when Philo, the head of the academy, had fled Athens along with Athenian nobles because of the Mithridatic War and had come to Rome, I gave myself totally over to him. Keep in mind what Cicero's talking about is Cicero is in Rome. All this is going on in the Forum, and they're Greek philosophers who are lecturing in Rome, and Cicero, who's your age, he's not in a room like this. He's outside listening to them lecture in Rome. I gave myself totally over to him, moved as I was by a marvelous enthusiasm for philosophy. In so doing, I hung around him more attentively, although the variety and vastness of the things themselves held me with the greatest delight. It seemed the courts of justice were gone forever. This passage contains 3 intertwined episodes of political violence, 2 in the past and 1 in the future. The person of Publius Sulpicius Rufus, the Mithridates War, and the closing of the law courts in Rome. Now listen to the violence. This is what I'm going to talk about. In what came to be known as the Asiatic Vespers, in 88 BC, Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, which is now the eastern Black Sea region of Turkey, orchestrated in Asia Minor the murder in a single day of some 80,000 Roman, Italian men, women, and children. in his move against Rome's Eastern Empire, this is the second violence talking about, Mithridates was taking advantage of anti-Roman sentiment in the East and of a very serious war in the heart of Italy, the social war from 91 to 88 BC, when Rome's Italian neighbors, socius is the Latin word for ally, went to war to win Roman citizenship and the benefits it provided. When the war began, most of the law courts in Rome closed because the praetors who ran the courts had to be at the front commanding troops. The social war ended in 88 BC when Romans granted full citizenship to most of their Italian neighbors, but there was to be no peace in Rome. For in that same year, Mithridates' actions in the East unleashed terrible and unforeseen violence in the city, violence for which Sulpicius Rufus, whom I mentioned earlier, was responsible. Now here's what happened. In 88, the Senate gave to the consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a successful general in the social war, command of an army to respond to Mithridates' aggression in the East. This command, giving a consul command of an army, was fully in keeping with the Republic's unwritten constitution, whereby consuls would lead Roman armies, especially if Rome were attacked from abroad. But Sulla's military command was coveted by the much older Gaius Marius, who had been a highly successful general and military leader who had already been elected consul 6 times. Marius was now a private citizen, but he was an ambitious man, and at 66 years of age, Marius suborned the tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus to get the command of the army that had been given to Sulla. Are you following me? So Sulla was supposed to command the army. Marius wants it. And Sulpicius was happy to oblige because he thought that Marius's popularity would help him get legislation through the assembly of the people. And in so doing, Sulpicius created a huge constitutional crisis. To take military command away from a sitting consul and give it to a private citizen was totally unkeeping. It's totally out of the context of what one did in ancient Rome, and even more out of keeping with Roman constitutional procedure was political violence. When Sulla and his fellow consul tried to suspend public business by creating a holiday, which meant that the people couldn't come to vote on this legislation, Sulpicius's armed supporters surrounded them in the forum, and to save his life, Sulla was forced to flee to Marius's house, but his colleague, Rufus's son, who was also Sulla's son-in-law, was killed by the mob. So the son, there were 2 consuls in ancient Rome. The son of Sulla's fellow consul was killed by the mob in the forum that had been initiated by Sulpicius. Marius allowed Sulla to leave safely if he lifted the justitium, the holiday, and Sulla acquiesced. But now a worse constitutional crisis ensued. Rather than accept this humiliating defeat, Sulla fled Rome and traveled to his army in the south, Nola in Campania, where it was assembled and preparing for the conflict that it was going to engage in as a campaign against Mithridates in the east. And he did something totally out of keeping with Roman tradition. He persuaded his legions to march on Rome. all but one of Sulla's officers refused to break precedent and bring an army in full battle gear into the sacred precincts of Rome. But Sulla went ahead and invaded the city. He defeated the hastily gathered forces of Marius and Sulpicius. Marius managed to escape, but Sulpicius was caught and killed in a seaside villa south of Rome. His severed head was brought back to Sulla, who placed it on the rostrum, the speaker's platform in the forum, to all to see. Do you have this image in your mind that Sulla was tribune, one of the 8 tribunes? Sulla had created this crisis. He literally lost his head, and it's placed on the rostrum. You're Cicero, you're 18 years old. This is what you're seeing. Reconfirmed as commander of the army against Mithridates, Sulla left for Greece. But the violence continued. In 87, so we're 88, 87, Marius returned to Rome with an army. And along with the army of the consul Cinna, unleashed a reign of terror against the supporters of Sulla. So you see what happened? Sulla comes and attacks Marius and Sulpicius. Then he leaves to go to the east. Marius comes back with an army and attacks the people who had supported Sulla. And these included many senators and many of Cicero's teachers. Cicero stayed out of these political disputes, but the violence he witnessed as a boy stayed with him throughout his entire life. 30 years later, in his treatise on the orator, Cicero graphically depicts the bloodshed that he saw during his student years in Rome. This dialogue was set in 91 BC. That's the fictional date with the De Oratore takes place. And it's just 3 days, just slightly before the outbreak of the social war. At the beginning of the book, the beginning of Book 3, we have a description of the violent deaths of almost all of the protagonists in this fictional dialogue. Cicero initiates his litany of violence by recounting the death of the spokesman, Cicero's spokesman of the dialogue, Crassus. And Cicero says, Crassus had given a speech in the Senate, and 6 days later, Crassus died. He had we're not really sure what killed him. He had some heart disease or something like that, but Crassus passed away, and Cicero writes, "Such calamities then fell upon the Republic that it seems to me that the immortal gods did not snatch Crassus's life from him, but made him the gift of death. He did not see Italy afire with war, nor the Senate burning with hatred, nor the most bitter fight of Caius Marius, nor the most crucial of all slaughters which took place after Marius's return, nor finally did he see the city disfigured. In every way, the city in which, when it was most flourishing, he had greatly outshone others in glory." And Cicero then goes on to describe the violent deaths that were the fate of almost all of the interlocutors. For example, the severed head of the orator Marcus Antonius was placed on the rostrum, and not far from it were the heads of Gaius Julius Strabo and his brother Lucius. The statue of Vesta was spattered with the blood of the eminent jurist and Cicero's teacher, Scaevola the Augur. And then he goes on to describe the deaths of it. So the big picture is that Cicero writes these treatises on the orator. He describes his teachers. And then in Book 3, he explains how most all of them died in this violence that had occurred because of what Sulpicius initiated. I guess for you to get some sense of what this must be like, imagine if Dr. Gish and all of your teachers were who are here defending the Constitution. suddenly you see their heads outside. I don't mean to be facetious, but I want you to get some sense of what Cicero is experiencing when he's your age. These are people, these are men he revered. These are his teachers. And this is what happens to him. So that this is something that's in Cicero that he wants to think about. How can we avoid this in the future? Listen to what Cicero says about Publius Sulpicius, who, as we have seen, was suborned by Marius to take away Sulla's command and was then killed when Sulla came to Rome. This is Sulpicius. But Sulpicius, having been involved in the mutual hatred that had flared up when he was tribune, began to strip of every honorable office those with whom he lived closely connected before he attained public office. The sword's iron snatched away his life as he flowered in the highest glory of public speaking. Not without great calamity for the state did he meet the penalty for his rashness. Sulpicius was 15 years older than Cicero, and Cicero probably met Sulpicius in Crassus's house. And the 18-year-old Cicero would have seen Sulpicius's head, severed head, lying on the rostrum, where only the days before he had stood in the full glory of his eloquence. So this is what Cicero is seeing. Now, Cicero attributes the civil war between Marius and Sulla to Sulpicius's lack of moral integrity. Cicero says Sulpicius betrayed old political ties and friendships when he abruptly turned his support to Marius and tried to curry the favor of the masses. Cicero praised Sulpicius's oratory. In a treatise that later in life Cicero wrote on oratory, he says he was drawn to hear Sulpicius speak in the Roman Forum. He talks about his strong and pleasant voice, his graceful gestures, his swift and flowing language. At the same time, and this is really interesting, he makes a point of observing that Sulpicius did not cherish broad learning. See the connection Cicero is making between education and moral integrity? In the De Oratore, he turns Publius Sulpicius Rufus into a foil for Crassus's assertion that the ideal orator needs broad learning. He has Sulpicius, Cicero makes this up, but he has Sulpicius say, I, Crassus, have no desire for your Aristotle or Carneades or for any other philosopher. You may reckon either that I have no hope of mastering these things or that I despise them, which I do. But for me, our ordinary knowledge of legal matters and public affairs is extensive enough for the eloquence at which I aim. So here you have Crassus saying the ideal education for the orator is going to be broad learning. You have Sulpicius saying to Crassus, I don't need it. I just need to be a good speaker, and I just need to know, have a knowledge of legal matters. And Cicero says that this is the man who created this constitutional crisis that led to all of this violence and led to his beheading. Now, Sulpicius makes this assertion in the fiction of the De Oratore. As a young man, he would have been 32 years old at the time of the dialogue, and he was one of the promising orators of Rome. Sulpicius's youth is important in bringing into focus Cicero's deep belief in the power of education to save the Republic. On many occasions, Cicero asserts that he wants young Romans to read his treatises and his speeches. And in his treatise on divination, which Cicero wrote in 44 BC, the year before he was proscribed and beheaded, Cicero was beheaded. That's how Cicero died, and Cicero's head was placed on the rostrum in the Forum. Cicero says that his writings were a form of public service. When Cicero was not active politically, he spent his time writing, and he saw his writings as a form of public service. And through his writings, he led his fellow citizens to the path of what he calls the best arts, the optimae artes, which is synonymous with the artes liberales. Now, after listing the books that he's written, Cicero's looking back on his life and talking about his scholarly activity. Listen to this. Those of you who are young, listen to this. For what greater and better service to the Republic could I render than that of teaching and educating young people, especially in these times and these morals in which our youth has fallen so low that we need everyone's help to restrain and control the young. Cicero actually saw the constitutional crisis of his time as, in part, being a crisis of the moral values of people your age. It's interesting to think about that. Now, how can the liberal arts ideal restrain and control the young? What is it about liberal arts, the liberal arts ideal that Cicero is expounding? What is it about the liberal arts that can make you a better person? And Cicero answers this question in one brief phrase. He says, philosophy makes a man good and strong. Philosophy makes a man good and strong. What does this mean? Philosophy, we know from the debate in the De Oratore, is synonymous with broad learning. Sulpicius disdained broad learning, and he started the cascade of civil wars that eventually led to the end of the Republic. If Sulpicius had read Plato, if Sulpicius had had the curriculum you guys have here, would he perhaps not have engaged in violence? That's what Cicero's implying. It's something to think about. If Cicero had had the great books that you're reading of Sulpicius, I'm being facetious, but if Plato's be one of them, Cicero is implying that perhaps if he'd had this kind of education, he wouldn't have let himself be suborned by Marius. At least these are questions that Cicero invites us to ask. Here, in part, is Cicero's answer: self-transcendence. Self-transcendence. If we look at Cicero's life and writings as a whole, we can discern two forms of self-transcendence that he believed could lead young Roman leaders to cherish and preserve the century-old republics by rising above personal ambition and the violence that often accompanied it. Cicero sees violence as in some ways coming from the personal ambition of talented political leaders. In his writings, Cicero lays out two complementary paths of learning for the young. The first involved remembering and pondering the customs and institutions that created the Republic. And the second involved perceiving the beautiful order of the universe and the eternal harmony which it manifests. To simplify for the sake of clarity, I'll call the first Roman political transcendence and the second Greek philosophical transcendence. So you have Roman political transcendence and Greek philosophical transcendence. What Dr. Gish talked about in his presentation is in large measure what I would call Roman political transcendence. We talked about the Lyceum product and so on, but there are other forms of transcendence which are Greek. In both cases, the individual is to become good and strong for the sake of something greater than his personal self and his own political ambitions. Let's look briefly at Roman self-transcendence, and then I'm going to talk about Greek self-transcendence, okay? In his treatise on the Republic, which we talked about yesterday, Cicero has Scipio the Younger observe that the Roman state, quote, did not rise through the genius of only one man, but of many, nor of only one generation, but in the course of several generations and lifetimes. Scipio recalls that Plato the Elder used to say, quote, there was never a genius so great that nothing could escape it, and never even many geniuses gathered together who could see in a single moment of history and grasp in thought without the experience that derives from the passage of time. So Romans have this sense of something that's occurring across generations, across time. In order to discuss the best form of government, Scipio thus proposes to go all the way back to the origins of the Roman people in order to show the development of the Republic from its infancy to its maturity. And in this way, Scipio says, I will achieve my goal more easily than if I were to imagine some state as Socrates does in Plato's work. Do you see the contrast Cicero's making? In Plato's Republic, Socrates creates an ideal republic. What Cicero says is, I'm not going to talk about the ideal republic. I'm going to talk about the actual Roman Republic, which is not an idea created in somebody's head, but was actually created by many, many people across time. So when Dr. Gish quoted Lincoln, he's actually talking about the American Republic and the formation of the American Republic across time, which is a very Roman way to do it. In his speech, Defense of Publius Cestius, Cicero urges young Romans to acquire a knowledge of the history of Rome and especially of the fundamental institutions of the Republic. So in this speech, Cicero is speaking to people like you, and he says, you need to know the history of the Republic and especially the history of the Senate. Now, this way of thinking historically is expressed by the Latin word auctoritas. Our word authority comes from auctoritas. In a well-known essay, What is Authority?, the philosopher Hannah Arendt tries to explain the disappearance of authority in the modern world. She observes that authority demands obedience, but is not power, because authority precludes coercion. If violence is necessary to enforce obedience, authority has failed. On the other hand, authority is not persuasion, because persuasion, while it eschews coercion, presupposes equality, whereas authority presupposes hierarchy. According to Arendt, the best way to understand authority is to compare the governance in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We end at 1.
About 10 before 8 before 1.
About, yeah.
10 minutes before 1.
Okay. Governance in Greek cities, she argues, was carried out either through coercion or persuasion. A tyranny governs through coercion, a democracy through persuasion. The Greeks had neither the experience nor the concept of political governance through authority. Both the word and the concept are Roman in origins. Auctoritas comes from the Latin word augere, which means to increase, enlarge, augment. What does Roman auctoritas augment? The founding of Rome. This is how Arendt puts it. Those endowed with authority were the elders, the Senate, the fathers, who obtained it by descent and by transmission from those who had laid the foundation for all things to come, the ancestors, whom the Romans called maiores, the greatest. The authority of the living was always derivative. It depended upon the authority of the founders, who were no longer living. Authority, in contradistinction to power, had its roots in the past, but this past was no less present in the actual life of the city than the power and the strength of the living. By the way, Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech, from my point of view, is showing authority. Because King, interestingly, does not denigrate the founding of the Roman Republic, of the American Republic. He has to be part of it. So he's looking to the past, but he's asking to be included in the founding. He was reminding us of the founding. He's reminding us of the Declaration of Independence and asking to be included in it. This way of thinking is uniquely Roman. It's a uniquely Roman way of form of self-transcendence. These are Cicero's words from a book he wrote much later on called The Orator. This is what Cicero says. Not to know what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. For what is human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors through the memory of old things, the remembrance of antiquity, and the mentioning of examples give a speech authority and credibility along with pleasure. So from a Roman point of view, you and I are all interwoven, especially interwoven into the founding of our own country. We experience ourselves as part of a psychic community across time. And this is Roman self-transcendence, and it created the patriotism and the nonviolent competition for political office that sustained the Republic for centuries. However, it fell apart in Cicero's time. Remember, I began this discussion with Cicero's talking about the violence he observed as a young boy in Rome. And yesterday we quoted from the famous beginning of Book 5 of Cicero's treatise on the Republic, where he says, on ancient ways and ancient men stand the Roman state, and that now has disappeared in Cicero's time. He says, before our times, the very customs of our ancestors would bring forth outstanding men, and eminent men would preserve the old ways and institutions of our forefathers. Now the ancient customs have so fallen into oblivion that they are no longer practiced and they are no longer known. And what shall I say of the men? Our customs died through lack of men. So this is oblivion. The customs are dead, and there are no men to bring them back to life. So what do? Roman self-transcendence is starting to be absent. How can, Cicero says, the Roman Republic is a painting and the colors have faded. It's even lost its shape. It's lost its form. Could the Roman Republic be resurrected? That's why Cicero is urging young people to learn the history of the Republic. But Cicero says what we need is another complementary form of self-transcendence, another whole of which the human being is a part, the cosmos. Do you follow what I'm getting at? That the Roman self-transcendence was enough to keep the Republic going, but it's gone now. So where can we look to give people, young people your age, a sense of belonging to something greater so that they can turn back and resurrect the Republic? This other form of self-transcendence can be found in Greek philosophy, especially in astronomy. It has to do with believing that the universe is beautiful and that you, through your reason, can perceive this beauty and be moved by it. This is what I'm going to talk about now. This is another form of self-transcendence. that Cicero says we need something to get people out of themselves. And if it isn't Roman history, what can it be? The stars. Kind of surprising. Where did this come from? Well, this is really interesting. This belief animates the work of many contemporary scientists. In a humorous account of his attempt to learn how to draw, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman speaks of his perception of the beauty of the universe. He has made a deal with his artist friend Jerry. On alternate Sundays, Feynman will give Jerry a lesson in science, and Jerry will give Feynman a lesson in art. You're smiling. Do you know this? Are you familiar with Feynman's book? Yeah. Okay. This is what Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist, says. I wanted very much to learn to draw for a reason that I kept to myself. I wanted to convey an emotion I have about the beauty of the world. It's difficult to describe because it's an emotion. It's analogous to the feeling one has in religion that has to do with a God that controls everything in the whole universe. There's a generality aspect that you feel when you think about how things that appear so different and behave so differently are all run behind the scene by the same organization, the same physical laws. It's an appreciation of the mathematical beauty of nature, of how she works inside, a realization that the phenomena we see result from the complexities of the inner workings between atoms, a feeling of how dramatic and wonderful it is. It's a feeling of awe, of scientific awe, which I felt could be communicated through a drawing to someone who has also had this emotion. It could remind him for a moment of this feeling about the glories of the universe. Maybe you feel that for plants. I always find that, I'm not a scientist, but I'm always blown away with this idea of the scientist. Your dean is smiling, right? Because she knows that there's something about the order and harmony of the plant world that it's kind of mind-blowing, but that's what Cicero is talking about. There's a sense of you're part of something greater, this beauty of nature. Now, Feynman's description of beauty parallels the meaning of the Greek word cosmos, which originally meant order or decoration, but Plato, our word cosmetic, comes from that. Originally, the word appears in the Iliad as kadakosmon, in good order, describing the stud of a horse's bit or Hera's jewels. And when we use the word cosmetic, you're thinking about beauty in that particular way. But the word came to signify so much more. Plato used the word cosmos to describe the totality of everything that is, the whole world. It was probably an act of faith on Plato's part. But to use the word cosmos, Plato asserts that nature is a beautiful and ordered whole that can be grasped by human reason. Nature is a beautiful and ordered whole that can be grasped by human reason. And when modern physicists talk about the beauty of nature, I think they're talking about something similar to what Plato is saying. Note that Feynman says this is an emotion. This is something you feel about the beauty of the world. But Feynman stops here. He doesn't go into where this emotion comes from or what it might mean. He just talks about the mathematical beauty of nature. Cicero and Plato, Cicero following Plato, draw metaphysical and ethical conclusions from this. And I'm going to quote you from an article called Plato on Why Mathematics is Good for the Soul. Basically, in Greco-Roman thought, to perceive is to receive. To perceive is to receive. One thinker calls this conjunctive vision. Conjunctive vision. You become one with what you perceive, with what you know. Now, this article, I'm going to quote, for Plato as for Aristotle, knowledge and understanding depend on receptivity. You submit your soul to be informed by the world as it is objectively speaking. A soul that assimilates the vast abstract system of mathematics in the curriculum is in turn assimilated to it. You become akin to the nature of what is. Now, in his Tusculan Disputations, Cicero talks about what happens when you observe the order and revolutions of the planets. Cicero says, "Let us suppose a certain man who excels in the best arts, and let's imagine him for a moment in our mind and thought. The best arts are the liberal arts." So this is somebody who's educated in liberal arts tradition. And then he says, listen to this, "What joy must not the soul of the wise man feels when he passes night and day in these studies, when he has looked closely at the motions and revolutions of the whole sky and seen the numberless stars fixed in the firmament and sharing its movement." So you're looking up at the heavens. Remember, there wasn't light pollution in ancient Rome, so you go out of your house and you see the heavens filled with stars. What happens to you when you see the heavens? This is what Cicero says. "To the soul examining and pondering these things day and night, there comes that knowledge enjoined by the God at Delphi, that the mind know its own self and feel itself united with the divine mind, from which it is filled with a joy that can never be satiated." Now, you've all heard the famous saying, "Know thyself." The oracle of Delphi says, "Know thyself." Now, we might think that's an invitation to engage in Freudian psychoanalysis. Figure out who you are, where you come from, what your gender. You could think of many, many things. That's not what Cicero is saying. I mean, imagine, you have to kind of take this in. When you go out and you look at the heavens, and you start to feel a joy by looking at those motions, revolutions of the heavens, you lose a sense of yourself. And Cicero says you feel yourself united with the divine mind. This is a key idea for Cicero, which he takes from the Greeks. And this is what we call the joy of learning. The idea that my mind and your mind are parts of the order and harmony of the universe, of nature in general. And Cicero actually calls this the divine mind. It's as though all that is, the cosmos itself is divine. It's a God. And each one of us, insofar as our reason participates in that, is a God. Do you follow what I'm saying? This is a kind of almost religious self-transcendence, that by observing the order and harmony of something, we become one with it. Now, I have to conclude soon, so we got to watching my time here, so I'm going to skip. Now, basically what Cicero is saying is that this self-transcendence is so delightful and so wonderful that it's an end in itself. And this is kind of Plato's philosopher, that in the act of contemplation, you experience a joy that could keep you contemplating forever. I'm sure you've all experienced that. Or I remember when I was in high school and you're working on a mathematical problem or geometric theorem, and when you finally get the answer, you feel that rush, kind of a kick. Well, imagine feeling that all the time. Wouldn't it be wonderful just to be a student, just to be studying all of your life? Cicero, that's Cicero. Cicero loved to study, but he says, as a good Roman, that's not enough. You need to serve the state. So what happens is you purify your soul from any kind of personal ambition, as in the case of Sulpicius or in the case of Julius Caesar. And once you've attained that inner purity, you then can go back and become part of the whole group of people who founded and established the Roman Republic. Now, there's a really interesting discussion that Cicero has about Julius Caesar, because Caesar was a very talented man, and Cicero is kind of interested in how it's possible that people with so much talent can also create so much harm, so much discord and lack of harmony. And Cicero, interestingly enough, says that Caesar never saw beauty. And he uses the Greek word, kalon. Caesar never saw beauty. And in her book, On Beauty and Being Just, that's the title of the book, On Beauty and Being Just, Eileen Scarry gives a kind of summary of everything I'm talking about, because she says that beauty ultimately is symmetry. And it's a symmetry of everyone's relation to everyone else. And beauty leads us to discover symmetry that comes into the place of justice. And where human communities are too young to have created justice, as well as in periods, as in Cicero's time, when justice has been taken away, beautiful things, which we do not create but which we see, hold steadily visible the manifest good of equality and balance. And this is what Cicero said is lacking in his own time, but the experience of beauty can remind us of the importance of equality and balance. At the end of a treatise on the Republic, Cicero says, who can consider someone happier than he who is freed from all mental agitations? For what military command, what civil magistracy, what kingdom can be more outstanding than the state of one who is looking down on everything human and considering it inferior to wisdom, never to revolve anything in his mind but the eternal and the divine? Such a one is convinced that while others may be called men, only those are who are polished by the proper arts of humanity. Humanitatis artes, that's the word our humanities comes from. Artes humanitatis. That's the liberal arts. So, to be polished by the arts appropriate to humanities, and I'm going to conclude with this thought, is to let Greek beauty prepare the soul of the statesman to renew the ancient ways and ancient men on which the Roman Republic stands. So if you let yourself be polished by the liberal arts tradition, then you have prepared your soul to engage in Roman self-transcendence. Thank you.